Hi. Today I'm going to talk to you about animal welfare. So, the first thing to talk about is, can animals have rights? And here's a sort of a kind of objection or worry you might have about the idea of animals having rights. When debating whether women deserve the right to vote, for example, it was a debate about whether women deserve the right to do something they could do. But lower animals can't vote, for example, so they can't have at least the right to vote. It's absurd to think animals deserve equal treatment because they can't be given the right to vote. Like, if they deserve equal treatment, they deserve, among other things, the right to vote. But the right to vote is an absurd thing to say that they have or deserve, so they don't deserve equal treatment. That's the sort of argument you might give against the idea of animals deserving of equal treatment. But women can have a right to an abortion despite the fact that men can't have one. It may be meaningless to talk about a man's right to an abortion or a pig's right to vote, but the basic principle of equality requires us to give each being equal consideration. And equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatment and different rights due to the particulars. So, I raise this as an opening objection to the idea that animals are equal because you can't treat them equal because they can't be given all the same rights as you can give a human being. But really, you can't give a man all the same rights you give a woman because there are different particulars. Treating somebody as equal doesn't necessarily mean giving them the same rights because it's shaped by the things that they're capable of, etc. We'll talk, you'll see more about what equal consideration is supposed to mean when we're talking about animal welfare in a little bit. But I want you to keep in mind this objection. This objection is equal treatment makes no sense because it's impossible to give them equal treatment. It's impossible to give them equal rights. And is that really a good objection or not? Okay, so this is the thing that Peter Singer is really concerned with in Are Animals Equal? Just a note about Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a utilitarian. He's famous for a number of reasons. He wrote a paper called Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which is this incredibly important paper about providing charity to famine-stricken countries. He's famous for doing all sorts of kind of Bill Gatesy, TED Talky, promotion of people donating and philanthropy to help people in really bad situations. So, and he donates large portions of his wealth to helping people. But he's a philosopher. He's a utilitarian, and he first came to prominence because in the 70s he wrote a book called Animal Liberation along with a philosopher named Tom Regan. But Peter Singer's the sort of more important one of the pair. And that sort of started the animal rights movement. So Peter Singer is the father of animal rights, vegetarianism, of the philosophical defense of animals. So one of the ways in which he tries to argue for animal welfare and animal equality, and he actually doesn't think of it as animal rights, but you could say animal rights, is that he says, well, what is it that we say when we say that all human beings, whatever their race, creed, sex, they're all equal? What is it that we're saying? Because whatever test we choose, it's simply not true that all human beings are equal. And even if it turned out that a certain race was unequal in strength or intellect or whatever, would that undermine what we mean when we say that all races are equal? Peter Singer thinks no. He thinks when we say that all human beings are equal, we don't mean literally they all have this, that it doesn't matter your sex, you're the same strength. Doesn't matter there could be populations of human beings who on average have a lower intellect. That does not matter to what we mean when we say every human being is equal. So what is it that we're saying is equal if it's not strength, intellect, etc.? The demand for equality among humans isn't due to actual equality of different races and sexes. When we say that everyone is equal, we mean that they are deserving of equal consideration. There's something about them that makes them equal when we're deciding what to do and we're trying to give consideration to the things that matter. They matter, and they matter equally to everybody else, including human beings, right? Women matter equally. Their They matter equally to men. Black people matter equal to white people. Asians matter equal to Muslims. The idea here is when I say all people are equal, what I mean is they all deserve equal consideration because of some feature they have in common. Now, we have to answer what that feature in common they have. We're going to get to that. So they're not equal in strength, intellect, whatever. And in fact, if it turned out to be true that a certain race just had, on average, 10 points lower IQ than some other race, that doesn't undermine the fact that they're equal in the sense that they deserve equal consideration. Why do they deserve equal consideration? So when we say that everyone is equal, we mean that they are deserving of equal consideration, not that they have equal strength, etc. And the reason they're equal is because they have interests. The interests of every being affected by an action are to be taken into account and given the same weight as the like interests, similar interests of any other being. So rocks don't matter. They don't deserve equal consideration. Trees, Singer's going to say don't matter because they don't actually have interests. You might object to that, but Singer's going to say trees don't have interests. Stop signs don't have interests. The number 2 doesn't have interests. Gravity doesn't have interests. Snow doesn't have interest. All of these things don't deserve equal consideration. What deserves equal consideration is anything with interests. That is, interest in how things go. Things can go better or worse for them, depending on how things turn out, and they have an interest in them going one way instead of the other way because they turn out better for them one way as opposed to the other. What gives them interest? Peter Singer's going to say the ability to experience pleasure and the ability to suffer, right? So if things go one way, I experience an enormous amount of suffering. If things go another way, no suffering, a little bit of pleasure. I have an interest in things going the way where I don't have I have an interest against the suffering outcome. So the ability to feel pleasure and pain gives me interests in how things go. And if I have interests, I deserve equal consideration. That's the sense in which Peter Singer wants to say all humans are equal. Persons, whether you're Asian, whether you're black, whether you're Muslim, whether you're a Jew, whether you're an American, whether you're an Iranian, whether you're a woman, whether you're a man, you all have interests because you can experience pain and you can experience happiness. And that makes things good or bad for how they turn out for you. You have interests, and those interests deserve equal consideration in our decisions about what to do. That's what Singer thinks. When we talk about all humans being equal, that all the races are equal, all the sexes are equal, all the nationalities are equal, what we mean is they all have interests and they all deserve equal consideration. And what Singer is trying to do is say, well, actually, dogs and cats, they can also experience pleasure and pain. So can dolphins, so can monkeys. And so the idea that we're all humans are equal due to the fact that we have interests, and our having interests is due to us being able to experience pleasure and suffering and happiness, that extends not just to women, not just to Asians or black people or all white people or children. It also extends to animals. He doesn't think it extends to plants. You might think, let's just speculate here. You could object, say, look, I think there are trees do have interests. They have an interest in, there's ways in which the tree can die, in ways that the tree can flourish. Peter Singer's going to say, no, that's not real interest in the way that we mean. We mean pleasure and suffering and happiness, and trees don't have that ability. Okay, so question. If possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another person for their own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans? This gets to what Singer's arguing. The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is the prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interests in any meaningful way. It would be nonsense to say that it was not in the interests of a stone to be kicked along the road by a schoolboy. A stone does not have interest because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we could do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. A mouse, on the other hand, does have an interest in not being tormented because it can suffer. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality, respecting the interests of every being that has interests, requires that its suffering be counted equally with the like suffering, insofar as rough comparisons can be made, of any other being. If a being is not capable of suffering, a tree, a rock, a stop sign, the number 2, gravity, or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account. This is why the limit of sentience is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. To mark this boundary by some other characteristic like intelligence or rationality, or skin color, or gender, or race, would be to mark it in an arbitrary way. Why not choose some other characteristic like skin color? This gets us into this idea that Singer is pushing, which is that the same reasons we think sexism and racism are wrong, because we believe in the principle of equality, that any being with interest deserves equal considerations of their interests, regardless of their intelligence level, regardless of their strength level. They can be unequal in all sorts of ways. It's because they have interests that we have to treat their interests as having equal weight in our decisions about what to do. That's the reason we treat the genders the same. That's the reason we treat the races the same. That's the reason why all human beings are equal. And if that's the reason all human beings are equal, it extends to non-human animals too, because they also can experience suffering and happiness. So they also have interests. And so really, there's this idea of speciesism. Prejudice is not just against sexes. It's not just against skin color. It's not just racism. It's not just sexism. There's also speciesism, where we say these beings suffering don't matter because they're not humans. And we are disregarding the equality of their interests, the equality of their suffering and their happiness, just like ours. That's what Singer's arguing. He's arguing the argument of this paper of all animals are equal is this trying to diagnose why racism and sexism is wrong, and then showing you that really, if you object to racism and sexism, it really means that speciesism is also wrong. And you have to go further than treating all humans as equal. You have to treat all beings that are capable of suffering and happiness as equal, that have interests. You have to treat their interests the same. The racist violates the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of his own race when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Similarly, the speciesist allows the interest of his own species to override the greater interest of members of other species. The pattern is the same in each case. Would the abolitionist be prepared to let thousands die if they could be saved by experimenting on a single animal? This is a question to him. The abolitionist, the person who wants to destroy speciesism and treat animals the same. Would he, Singer, be prepared to let thousands die if you could sacrifice a single animal to save thousands? The way to reply to this purely hypothetical question is to pose another. Would the experimenter be prepared to perform his experiment on an orphaned human infant? If that were the only way to save many lives. I say orphan to avoid the complication of parental feelings, although in doing so I'm being over-fair to the experimenter since non-human subjects of experiments are not orphans, whatever. If the experimenter is not prepared to use an orphaned human infant, then his readiness to use non-humans is simple discrimination. Since adult apes, cats, mice, and other mammals are more aware of what is happening to them, more self-directing, and, so far as we can tell, at least as sensitive to pain as any human infant. So, if you want to object to Singer, but we have to be able to experiment on non-human animals in order to test medicines, to experiment on psychological research, in order to test cosmetics, which is what often animals can be used to be tested. Singer's going to say, that's fine, as long as it's not speciesism, as long as you're willing to do it to a human too. Maybe you have an orphan animal who doesn't have a family, but like, say we have an orphan human infant. Why can't we test the drugs on that human orphan infant? If you're not willing to do that, it's just because of this stupid prejudice that's based on not the fact that they don't feel suffering like the infant does. They do. It's not like, and in fact, an adult horse is far more self-aware than a human infant at 3 months. So, there's no reason that you're refusing to experiment on the infant, but willing to do it on the horse, other than the same sort of pure prejudice that underlies racism and sexism. So I'm going to end with this quote here. This is a very famous quote from Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is the founder of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham was the first utilitarian. Then we have John Stuart Mill, who kind of like really gave the classic expression of it. And then I think Peter Singer, there's a couple other famous utilitarians, but Peter Singer is the most sort of famous living utilitarian right now. But anyway, here's this quote from Bentham, which I think it ends very powerfully. But Bentham wrote, "The day may come when the rest of animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny. The French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may one day come to be recognized that the number of the legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is it that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose they were otherwise, what could it avail? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?"